Last time we covered Pac-Man's beginnings and even dug up some of his more forgotten arcade titles. But now we're taking a look at the transition between arcades and home consoles, specifically with the first original 16-bit Pac-Man games. Before we jump into our three titles though, I've got some other quick stuff to cover. Obviously, between Pac-Man's arcade debut and our brand new titles here, there are plenty of ports that were released before any of this new stuff came out. For example, Pac-Man and many of the subsequent sequels and spin-offs were ported to various home consoles and handhelds. I've got a couple instances here, for example Miss Pac-Man on the Game Boy. It also contains Super Pac-Man. It's kind of funny to me that Namco's sequel is just a footnote here compared to Miss Pac-Man, but otherwise it's a really great port, just not my favorite version. That award probably goes to Miss Pac-Man on the Sega Genesis, which has a lot of really cool additions. For one, there are a whole lot more options to change up the experience here, including a sort of speed boost button similar to Super Pac-Man. But the best part is simultaneous multiplayer. Not enough ports include cool stuff like this. Hell, we've gotten so many ports of the original Super Mario Bros. Over the years, and yet not one has included simultaneous multiplayer yet. That would be cool as hell. One of my personal favorites from my Pac-Man collection is the original game for the Famicom. Oh, and by the way, if you're curious why it says Namco and not Namco, that's because Namco was actually a subsidiary that was in charge of the home console games for a little while. I never knew they existed until I managed to track down this cartridge. Anyhow, ports alone do not a franchise make, so of course we got a couple extra Pac-Man games. Considering the decline of arcades and the beginning of wars between consoles and colorful mascots, Pac-Man had to find a new way to stand his ground in the 16-bit era. And well, these games certainly do stand out, for better or worse. Let's dive right into it, starting with the 1993 puzzle game, Pac-Attack. So that's what they're called. So, Pac-Attack is pretty similar to the other dropping tile games like Tetris or Puyo Puyo. You drop blocks and clear lines to get points. Only issue though is the ghosts, which try to clog up your board and prevent you from clearing lines. Thankfully though, you can get Pac-Man to travel through the board and clean up any ghosts along the way. This means you'll be keeping track of not only trying to make lines, but dropping ghosts in patterns and locations that allow Pac-Man to gobble up as many as he can. It's a pretty unique puzzle game and relatively easy to get into. I'm pretty bad at stuff like Tetris, so this kind of simpler system clicked with me a lot. Of course, like any good puzzler from this age, you can duke it out with another person in 2-player versus mode. But there's another third game option that's both interesting and also a great way to get an idea of how this game's mechanics work. There's a puzzle mode in Pac-Attack that gives you 100 levels to work through with the goal of eating all the ghosts. You'll get some pieces to try and set up a path for Pac-Man. You'll get a couple Pac-Mans to clear the board, so you can recover from a mistake here and there, but if you manage to clear it with the minimum Pac-Mans, Pac-Men? Pac-People? You'll get a special little message congratulating you. I like that there's a nice bit of feedback for nailing a stage, but there's also room to clean up mistakes. My only initial complaint was not being able to restart whenever I made a stupid little mistake, but turns out you actually can restart just by pressing start and select, which was super helpful. And with 100 puzzles and some new mechanics introduced in later stages, the puzzle mode here is great fun, and honestly it's a perfect little tutorial to get you trained and prepared for the main endless mode. After working through some of the puzzle mode stages, I tried my hand at seeing how long I could last on easy. And hey, I got 8th place on the leaderboard. Not too shabby for a puzzle game novice, right? Okay, I have to try the hyper difficulty just to see how long I can last. Okay, yeah, this is rough. I think I lasted like a minute and a half tops. Wait, hold up a second. I played for a minute and I'm first? Let's see, with a score of 2,014,401? What the hell just happened? Upon further reflection, for just picking the hyper difficulty, I got 2 million points at the start? You're telling me that you get 20 times the points of the highest default score just for picking the highest difficulty? I think that is probably the stupidest decision I have ever seen in a puzzle game. Well, other than that strange blunder, the game really is solid. I love the music tracks for each mode and the little Pac-Man flair each one has. Although I'm not really sure why the track for being in danger is the can-can. But whatever. Not bad for our first game of 3, and that's coming from someone who isn't really a huge puzzle game fan. Bit of a shame it's not really a new Pac-Man game though. It's actually just a new skin of another Namco arcade game called Cosmo Gang the Puzzle. Yeah, not and the puzzle, Cosmo Gang the Puzzle. Interestingly enough, there's also a Katamari Damacy version of this game that was released on the Nintendo DSi, only in Japan of course. Unfortunately, all my hope and curiosity ends here, as I am far too familiar with our next game. Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures, released in 1994 on the SNES and Genesis. In case you're unaware, I tackled this game and did a full-on review of it earlier. The research I did for that video and the success are what inspired me to make this series in the first place. If you haven't seen my video on it, I highly recommend it, as it's probably one of my favorite reviews I've done so far. Since this isn't the first time I've tackled this game, I'll try to keep it brief. I did play through it all again for this video, since I needed to get footage again, so have my thoughts changed at all since the first time? God no, this game is still so painful to play. The only part I enjoyed was the fact that I now know where everything is, so at least I was able to beat it a little bit more quickly. I still ran into the exact same problems as last time though. In Pac-Man 2, or Hello Pac-Man as it's called in Japan, you wield a slingshot to guide Pac-Man around to complete missions, from collecting milk to defeating the gum monster. This means you have no direct control over Pac-Man himself, you're completely at the mercy of his attention span and seemingly random mood. Even knowing where to go and what to interact with, there is absolutely no guarantee Pac-Man will follow through. Once again, Pac-Man wouldn't pick up the stupid flower. Once again, he wouldn't interact with the guard, he'd just get lost, go through long areas with no easy way back, and just waste more of my time. This time, I even had several instances where I used a power pellet, but Super Pac-Man would just miss a ghost, meaning I'd either have to toss him another one, or I'd just be stuck in a terrified animation for the next century. It's incredibly frustrating. The game looks nice, it's well animated, music is fine, but God, playing through it is just such an insufferable experience that I felt completely worn out just from my 2-hour playthrough. Needless to say, the game has not grown on me. Stay away at all costs. Luckily, I do have much higher hopes for our next and final game. Released on the SNES, Game Boy, and even MS-DOS, we have a Pac-Man game that I think has truly been forgotten by time. A bit ironic considering it's called Pac-In-Time. Pac-In-Time was developed by Callisto Entertainment, and it both shares some surprising similarities with previous titles, and also some strange new differences. The Ghost Witch from Pac-Man 2 makes a return here, this time sending Pac-Man back to the past, specifically in 1975 apparently, and making him much younger, hoping to trap him there so she can continue doing whatever nefarious stuff Ghost Witches do. It's up to Pac-Man to avoid the dangers of 1975. You know, pet rocks, disco, the Vietnam War, sheep people, Gerald R. Ford. Pac-In-Time is a 2D platformer with some puzzle elements here and there. It's actually pretty similar to the arcade titles in a way. Each level has dots to collect and an exit. In order to open the exit and move on to the next level, you've got to collect nearly all the dots in a level, meaning you'll be moving around and exploring every nook and cranny until you can progress to the next stage. It's pretty similar to how running around the maze in the original titles worked. It's a surprisingly faithful idea, and it's executed pretty well here. Because he's now a kid again, Pac-Man isn't as mobile as usual, so you'll need to use your natural abilities along with some other useful tools. The physics in this game are pretty weird, not necessarily in a bad way, they're just unusual. You'll kind of roll around a bit like a ball, you'll bounce off of stuff, you get the idea. Thankfully, traversal is pretty easy thanks to the power-ups Pac-Man has at his disposal. You can hop through rings to gain these abilities, and going through them again will remove them. Sometimes you'll need to solve puzzles to avoid rings, or you'll have to give up an ability to progress, but overall that mechanic isn't used very often. Pac-Man's got 4 power-ups this time. A fireball attack that you can shoot out incredibly quickly just by mashing to get rid of any enemies blocking the way. This is pretty much only useful for taking out enemies before they take out you. The hammer, on the other hand, has much more versatility. You can use it to take out bad guys at close range, but it will also make holes in some parts of the ground, allowing you to access new areas. While both these abilities are pretty great on the ground, you'll need to use the bubble to swim in water and attack aquatic enemies. But by far the most interesting and most useful power-up is the rope, which lets you zip and swing around each level. It really makes you feel like Pac-Man. Not only is it super useful, it can also let you perform some cool tricks and fly through parts of levels. The game makes heavy use out of it, and most levels will involve using it to climb around, or sometimes the whole level is built around just trying to find it so you can reach all the dots at the top. Compared to the other power-ups, it's required a ton, and most of the time you'll be using it to get around instead of just walking or bouncing. The game also looks pretty weird compared to other Pac-Man titles so far, especially the enemies. Everything looks a bit better in the original art style, as shown in some of these graphics, but either way, it's certainly very different to previous games. The game is also pretty damn long too, with a total of 5 worlds, each comprising of 10 levels. As you progress, levels get bigger, there are more dots, more complexities, more ways to die, more instant kill traps. The game quickly becomes surprisingly brutal. Near the end of World 4, I had to use pretty much all my continues just to beat a single level. Yeah, this game has lives and continues, and man can they be rough. If you die, you'll lose any of the abilities you grabbed in the level, but you'll keep all the dots you collected. Run out of lives though, and your continue will force you to start the level over entirely. Run out of continues, it's back to the title screen. The game uses passwords for every 5 levels, but with how complex and challenging they can become, this eventually becomes brutal. Thankfully, there's a level select code that lets you pick any level. I ended up using this code a lot. The first world didn't give me too much trouble at all, save for clipping into the ground and having to reset. It only took me about an hour to reach World 2. However, this is where the game starts increasing in difficulty like crazy. If I beat the first world in an hour, it shouldn't take long to clear the rest, right? But single levels started taking several lives and continues to complete, to the point where it could take me over half an hour to beat a single stage. And as more mechanics are thrown at you without explanation, and more threats and even instant death traps appear, it got to the point where progressing was incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and if I'm being honest, just not fun. Sometimes I'd have to pause and watch a speedrun just to figure out what I'm supposed to do. Getting these dots in the forest seemed completely impossible to me until I watched someone else do it. I mean, look at this and tell me that this makes sense. And in the next world, they introduce pipes you can open with the rope. Once again, without explanation, not to mention the fact that they're incredibly finicky. I got to the 4th world before deciding I didn't want to put up with it any longer. I just ended up playing the final level a bit before giving up and skipping to the boss level with the level select code. The final boss here really isn't too interesting either, just the gum monster from Pac-Man 2. You push him to his death, and then you head home. When I first started Pac-In-Time, I really did like it, but it quickly spikes in difficulty, and I feel like I was wasting my time. I was even thinking about speedrunning it at some point just for shits and giggles, since any time would guarantee second place on the leaderboard, but I couldn't even finish the damn thing in a casual playthrough. Special shout out to Joester98, who runs a ton of Pac-Man stuff and holds most of the world records. Without his speedrun as a guide, I don't know if I would have even made it past World 2. Pac-In-Time is really unique, and it has some really cool ideas, but it just quickly became too frustrating. The mechanics are totally fine, there's a solid game in here somewhere, it's just the awful, labyrinthian levels and almost unavoidable traps ruin this game. I do still think it's interesting enough to recommend playing, but I certainly wouldn't recommend finishing it. The SNES version is definitely the best version though. The Game Boy and DOS versions are completely different. The Game Boy one is closer to the SNES version, just with different levels, while the DOS game is just a reskin of another Callisto game called Fury of the Furries, which is absolutely nothing to write home about. So unfortunately, none of these games were exactly the next step for Pac-Man. Honestly, the only one I truly enjoyed was Pac-Attack, which is a bit unfortunate. Moving forward, Namco ended up going in 2 directions, and thankfully I have much higher hopes for both of them. 5 years after Pac-In-Time, the Pac-Man World Trilogy began, a series of 3D platformers that ended up being a commercial and critical success. But before we dive into that series, there's another trilogy of Pac-Man games that started in 2000 and ended after only a year for us to dive into. Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man's Return to Form, exploring mazes, goblin ghosts, and devouring dots. Now in the 3rd dimension. I'll admit, I'm a bit worried considering they managed to release all 3 of these games in only a little over a year, but hey, maze games are what these 2 do best, right? Right?